Welcome back to another episode of CamBro Conversation. And today's conversation, we are talking about addressing strength imbalances. To do so, we are joined by Coach Chris Mota from Unit 4 in Glasgow. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Colin.
Pleased to have you on, and I think we seem to have a lot of couples on the podcast. So you are the partner of former guest Sarah Allen in the CrossFit circle in Glasgow. It's a small but very tight knit group.
Yeah, there's only a few of us, but we all seem to know each other, and me and Sarah know each other quite well.
So the reason that I was so keen for you to be the guest to discuss this particular topic, Chris, is that you and I did a little bit of work over Zoom just as the gyms were starting to reopen in Scotland for the first time back in August, and I found it a really helpful discussion to look at some of the imbalances that I have when it comes to strengths across my body, back and forward. And the context that you gave it within, and we'll talk about the athlete's hierarchy of needs, was really helpful for somebody that's very into it like myself. But I think many of the listeners, even who maybe don't have the same scientific interest within it, or maybe they do, will still benefit from that. So I guess first things first, do you want to delve a little bit into the athlete's hierarchy of needs and what that actually means other than just some nice terms?
Yeah, so when I'm working with a client, we like to build a case for what we're going to actually focus on. So we always start with flexibility. For argument's sake, there's lots of definitions of flexibility and mobility, but we have flexibility as what you can do passively. Other people might categorize it some other way, but just to keep it really simple, that's what we call it, just passive range of motion. Above that, we have mobility, and that's what you can do actively. So a good example is if you're to lay on your back and let your arm go above your head, gravity's helping you, that's passive. If you have to stand up and do it, that's active, so that would be your mobility, as opposed to your flexibility laying down. Next up is strength balance. So that is how strong your left side of your body is compared to the right, how good you are at pulling versus pressing, and then kind of just lots of other things I'm sure we'll get into in a second as well.
Yep.
And then there's two more categories, your rest and your recovery. So are you working out 6 days a week, 7 days a week, not taking any time off, really stressed at work? You're going to come to some sort of problem eventually in that case. So if that's a problem, it's going to cascade down and fall into the other categories as well. And then finally, which is probably the area people look at first, is skill. So trying to learn how to do a squat. If you go to a coach, they're going to just teach you how to do a squat, and it's a good place to start. But if you don't have the ankle range of motion, hip range of motion, knee range of motion, you're going to have a really hard time. Doesn't matter how great they are at teaching you, you just can't really do it.
I think that's incredibly interesting, because when you look at this as a set of building blocks or one on top of the other, like you say, we typically do jump to, oh, what's my form like or my technique like on my squat or my deadlift? Whereas if you strip back, some of the reasons that form or technique are not correct could be the passive flexibility we've got. It could be the active mobility we've got. It could be the strength balance, which is the area that we'll focus on for today's conversation. So I certainly find that really interesting that from your approach as a coach, you strip it back to, let's look at these other boxes and these building blocks that have formed the part of the skill before we jump to, oh, are my lats tight enough on this deadlift? There's so much more that comes first.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's much more that comes before that. And if you take the deadlift, for example, that's usually the one that people are like, oh, I hurt my back and it was because of that last deadlift I did. My form must have been really, really bad. And you know what? It might have been. Like it might have been really bad form, but your body's pretty resilient and it can handle bad form, but it can't handle that repeated over time, added onto an imbalance, added onto a flexibility restriction. Something's got to give eventually with that, but form usually isn't the answer to that.
Yeah, I think within this hierarchy of needs, there's so many different areas we could focus on. For the purposes of having a really good, helpful, actionable 1 hour chat, we'll delve right into the strength and balances, but I'm certainly sure that as the listeners enjoy this one, they'll probably be clamoring for you to come back on and talk about some of the other areas too. But in terms of strength and balances, what are some of the common pains and complaints that you see that you identify as a strength imbalance?
I think it's probably easiest to start with the lower body and kind of work our way up. So the biggest one I see with the lower body is a difference between the right and the left leg. So in a squat, for example, they're much stronger on the right, so they're always favoring that side. And most people know this, like they're gonna be like, oh yeah, it's my good leg, or most people are like referring to their bad leg generally. They're like, oh, just that bad knee, yep, that's the one. Never doing anything to correct it or even think about it. What we use to test that is a front rack barbell step up. So as if you're ready to do a front squat and then you're stepping up onto a box. It's about the height of your knee. So just going to put you kind of just below parallel in that squat position with your foot on the box. And you should just be able to do the same on both sides. If you can't do that, it's a pretty clear problem.
Yeah, and that's a common way for us to be aware of when we're going down in a squat, when we are imbalanced to either side, when we're both going down but maybe going up as well. That can lead to, what's the kind of most typical complaint? Is it around knee pain? Is it around back pain?
Yeah, I think it's going to settle somewhere. So usually with this left to right imbalance in the lower body, it's going to either go to the knee, or the next place it's usually going to go is the lower back. So we actually see this really commonly with people with really severe back pain. They actually have a really, really big difference in their left to right strength. I've got a couple of people come to mind where they can back squat probably close to 150 kilos, and they couldn't do a single step up on one of their legs with an empty barbell.
Yeah.
So that other leg was pretty damn strong, but it was just having to take over so much load from the weaker side that they were always just totally shifted in their position, just loading up one side of their back up so much.
Yeah, and we're compensating for imbalances across other areas of our body. So we maybe, like you say, it starts to load onto the knee, it starts to load onto the lower back, depending on where it kind of manifests itself. And you said the main test for lower body symmetry of strength, so to speak, is that step up, and it's front racked. So you have a barbell almost in a
a barbell generally. Some people are not going to be able to do that just with mobility restrictions, stuff like that. So you can swap it out for a pair of dumbbells, but keeping it in the front of the shoulders just keeps it closely related to some numbers we're going to go through later on with some other lower body lifts. If you change the position, it kind of changes how you're loaded up a little bit, and you need to change those a little bit. So front rack for the barbell, same thing with dumbbells, just resting on the front of the shoulders, and then box height just above the knee.
Yeah, for those that are listening at this point and they're very interested in testing some of these things themselves, obviously you've got the ability to listen back and fast forward back and forth. But if you take down some notes, because these were tests that I did through Chris that were extremely helpful for me. So we've got these imbalances between our left and our right leg. It's visible within our squat. It can sometimes cause us pain. We know how to test it in terms of loading up. Can both legs do the same number of reps with the same amount of weight? Where are other areas of pain throughout our body, or other areas of imbalance that we tend to find?
So sticking to the kind of left to right imbalances, if you go up to the upper body, looking at a press, probably one of the most common movements people are going to do in the gym, especially mostly guys going to be doing a lot of bench press, a lot of overhead pressing.
Yep.
And there is a lot of barbells being used, especially in CrossFit where I'm doing most of my work. We are using a barbell a lot more than probably the average person. So that left to right imbalance, really similar to the lower body with the step up. We're going to test that with a one arm press. So just a dumbbell press. Most people have had some sort of exposure to this. We like to test it in the bottom of the lunge position. So you really have no choice but to just use your arms. You can't really get any sort of bounce out of it in that position. And we also like to make sure he's getting that full range of motion. So getting the elbow down as low as possible, kind of getting the tricep to the rib cage at the bottom of the rep, and then extending the arm completely at the top for a full rep.
Yeah, when I'm picturing overhead barbell presses, there's a number of people I've trained with over the years, and then you look around the gyms and you see the asymmetry in their pressing overhead, and I've 100% heard the terms like that's my strong side, or I'm lopsided this way and my right picks up more of the load, and you're thinking, well, really that should not be the case if we are hopeful of being injury proof for the longer term, progressing longer term, having a a foolproof approach long term to our training rather than picking up these little niggles. And I've said this before, one of the keys to my longevity and continued progress over the years is I can count the number of times where I've had to take a day or two or a week or two off the gym on one hand. And if you can keep yourself injury free, you can see much more linear progress because of that. So I think when you give the overhead press example, it's a very, very common one that's lopsided. And I can already picture in my head, and I'm sure many of the listeners can as well, hopefully, when you're lopsided in terms of the actual direction of the press, quite often the loading does come onto your lower back as well. And I've seen a lot of people with that rounded lower back when they're pressing overhead as well. Chris, is that quite a common one?
Yeah, I think especially if you start pressing really with one side, you're going to see the barbell go up at a funny angle. And you're probably look at right across the gym and see somebody doing it and notice straight away that it's a problem. And they should probably notice it too. If like the barbell starts moving up faster on one side of your body than the other, that should be quite clear. And yeah, if your weight is now off to one side, that's going to put more pressure on your lower back, as well as just that shoulder trying to do all that work is probably not going to handle it so well. And
we've got a clear test for that, which is in the lunge position with a single arm dumbbell or kettlebell, whatever is best, tricep to rib cage at the bottom of the movement, and then straight up overhead, kind of almost when you were describing it to me, for me to do it, it was using your inner arm to cover your ear, which was
so trying to keep your arm quite close to your body rather than coming out to the side. You want to kind of keep your hand almost right in front of you, and then you're just going to punch up directly over your head, so like as close to your body as you can. It just helps with the full range of motion, and it keeps our numbers kind of where we want them to be with our testing.
As a more aesthetics focused lifter, I found this quite a challenge because you kind of tend to, I was always good at keeping my elbows in maybe 45 degrees rather than the whole 90 flared, but having it complete, like a lot more square to press overhead, I found a lot more challenging. And I certainly realized that there was maybe some limitations in my active range in my shoulder, which I could work on. And we both know that from our discussion.
I think when you're training in one kind of realm all the time, you do kind of get pigeonholed into these little areas where you might not get exposure to things. I know obviously you've been experimenting a lot with kind of functional training a lot more, and you're probably finding like new things each week, like, oh, I didn't realize I wasn't going to be that good at that, or I thought I'd be better at this movement because I've done so much pressing, I thought I'd be really good at this kind of press. But it doesn't necessarily always perfectly transfer over. I'm sure you're probably better than the average person coming in and trying this movement, but compared to someone that does it an awful lot, maybe not.
Yeah, so we can test our one-sided strength again for pressing with that, and we can know roughly what each side does. So if I can get 5 reps at 20 kilos on my right side, but only 3 on my left side with with the same weight, then we've got an imbalance. We've got a reason for why my overhead barbell press is looking a bit squint.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say there that some people might look at that and say, oh, but 3 and 5 are so close together. If you look at it in terms of percentages, the 5 versus the 3, that's 166% of the 3 reps. When you say it like that, it's like, oh, geez, okay, that's actually a really big difference. Just when people see the small numbers next to each other, it just doesn't look so bad. If you put that to 9 and 15, you're like, oh man, that's such a huge difference. But it's the same percentage.
I was being quite generous there as well, because I've seen people with much bigger gaps than that as well. Like,
oh, I've seen people with 10 to 1.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's insane.
You can imagine what the compensating that somebody's doing at that stage. The most common one I see is because one of my favorite back movements when I train like a pull session with somebody is single arm dumbbell row. And the number of people you see who get 4, 5, 6 reps, no problem, more on their strong arm, because they're like, they tend to start with it for starters. They're like, oh, I'll start with my right or my left, whatever's the stronger one. And they bang out this number of reps, whatever, let's say 15. And then they pick up the weight on their left side, which should be more rested because the right side is worked before it.
Yeah.
And they get 5 reps less, and they're like, oh, that's such a big difference. And it can be as simple as like grip strength. I know that my grip strength on my right is better than my left, and I noticed that. But for people to notice that muscular difference is quite significant. And I know we're talking a lot about imbalances when it comes to using a barbell, but I think a lot of people in the bodybuilding space should hopefully be using a lot more unilateral work. But I think in CrossFit, you see a lot of people use the barbells more often because that's the kind of genesis of a lot of the movements.
Yeah, I think it's and it also a lot of CrossFit gyms just have more barbells than they have dumbbells, so it's just easier to write it into the program.
Yeah.
I know, like for myself, writing the workouts for Unit 4, there is only so many days we can get the dumbbells in, just because it's a little bit harder logistically. Historically, we've not had them for that long in comparison. We've had a couple members come back after a little while, and they're like, "Oh, dumbbells! I've not used these before."
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, you were here before we had them. So yeah, I think you're right. I think you would hope that people in a more bodybuilding training regime would be using dumbbells a lot more. But then again, like if you're on a machine a lot of the time, you're not gonna get the benefit of the two independent arms there.
Yeah, I'm a huge advocate of unilateral work, and I think that's one of the reasons that my imbalances when we tested weren't really left to right. They were more like what range I was able to get with both sides effectively.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite an interesting one. But then again, I've trained with plenty of people who are more bodybuilding focused and been horrified by the by the differences in their in their strength side to side. So we've covered lower body. So quite often we see that somebody's maybe got a lopsided squat or deadlift, and it comes down to maybe their left leg being weaker than the other. Pressing, we've got an imbalance left to right. What is a further imbalance that you typically see, Chris?
So the last one really complements the press, actually. It's an upright pull. So you're mentioning the dumbbell row, that would be a horizontal pull pulling towards your body. If you're going to pull upwards, so if you're just standing tall and then pulling a dumbbell up towards your shoulder, that would be an upright pull. And that's a dumbbell high pull, what we refer to as, I'm sure it's called an upright row sometimes.
Yep.
And this is the one that probably gets most people. You should be able to do just as much with the upright row as you can with the dumbbell press. Same weight, same reps on both arms, which is where most people are going to probably see a really big drop off.
Yeah. I find mine is considerably weaker, and it's only a movement that I've recently started since I spoke to you in August about it. And you spoke to me about what that actually means for your scapular position, and a lot of the listeners will have listened to previous podcasts where we've spoken about desk workers needing to have working on their scapular retraction and protraction and making sure we've got greater control of it and looking after ourselves when it comes to pressing and pulling. The high dumbbell pull or the upright row, that's another movement for the scapula in terms of the muscles around it and being able to manipulate that, which I found a new stimulus for me.
Yeah, and it's new for most people. The closest you're probably going to get to this is like a barbell upright row. Doesn't quite get the same. Usually the range of motion is quite a bit less, and obviously you've got the other hand to assist there. But what you're actually looking at the scapula is as you're pulling up, you get a slight retraction just to get yourself into the position. Then it's mostly rotating upwards as you pull. So if you were to think about yourself doing a pull-up, see that the scapula kind of move down and towards each other, rotating downwards. This is essentially the exact opposite movement there. So it really complements that really, really well.
The fact that you need to be able to move your scapula both ways is so forgotten about, particularly because it's so neglected in the first place. So everyone talks about retracting and pulling it down. So doing more pull-ups, doing more lat pull downs and working on that movement. But for me, I totally neglected and forgot about the fact that the scapula has another function in terms of going up the way. And equally, if you can control that, I think that can only be good for your shoulder health and your overall posture. Yeah,
definitely. I think you should really be able to do every direction relatively equally. So if we can go into some of the percentages here, then if you class your body weight as 100%, so let's say 75 kilos, for example, and you can do 10 pull-ups, then the high pull and the press, and these numbers are going to be exactly the same for these two.
Yep.
You should take a third of your body weight. So for you, that would be 25 kilos, and you should be able to do the same number of reps as you did for pull-ups. So that would be 10. So most people are going to look at that and go, oh, damn, okay, I didn't think I could do that many. Maybe I can only do 5 pull-ups, but 25 kilos is quite a heavy weight to press for the average person. Especially then as your body weight goes up, the weight that you have to press then goes up as well.
Yeah.
So that's where you're going to see probably quite a big difference there between the high pull and the press and then the pull-up.
I found that really interesting when we ran the numbers. So for the purposes of this, I'm 75 kilos. Like Chris said, if I knock out 10 pull-ups, then that's the kind of start number that we're working at.
Yeah.
We go to doing 33% of that, so 25 kilos, and we're looking to do that for the same number of reps. So we should be able to dumbbell high pull, which, do you want to talk the listeners through the form on that? Because I think a lot of people are maybe picturing an upright barbell row, and
yeah.
I know we can maybe use that shoulder impingement cue, which might help.
Yeah, so there's a test called the Hawkins Kennedy test, which is used for shoulder impingement. And this is where like some people give a little bit of pushback on the dumbbell high pull movement because it looks quite similar, but the function is actually the complete opposite. So in the Hawkins Kennedy test, you have your hand across the opposite side of your body with your elbow raised up high, and then they press against your hand, pushing it towards the middle of your body. And that's test to see if there's any impingement in the shoulder. Because we're not pushing the hand inwards and we don't have the hand as far across to the opposite side of the body, it just doesn't have the same function in the shoulder. You don't have that overpressure. You're actually resisting that movement. If not, your hand would swing off to the side and your dumbbell would fly away from you. So you need to actually resist that movement to pull the dumbbell up in front of you. One thing that people do get kind of mistaken here is the range of motion. And what we look for is whatever you can do unloaded. So basically, if you're zipping up your jacket, can you zip up all the way to the top, like all the way to your chin? Great. That's how high you should be pulling the dumbbell up as you pull.
Yeah, I think that was a really good cue for me, that whole zipping the jacket process, and the start point with my hand being slightly internally rotated, sitting just in front of my pelvis, like directly below my belly button, pulling my zip up to my chin, and with my elbow finishing high. Now, I definitely cannot pull 25 kilos doing that for 10 reps, but I'm actually misleading you. I could easily do like 15, 20 pull-ups. So I'm actually just making it even harder for myself to do the same number. The interesting one in the third strand is that single arm press in a lunge position. I think I'm a lot closer there, and I think more people, particularly those that have maybe overtrained pressing over the years, will find that part a little bit easier. But
yeah,
the fact that the other range in our scapula, the kind of the upright motion with it through the high pull is so weak, should be an area of concern, and it became an area of concern for me because I just questioned whether I was looking after my scapula well enough. And this is not to give listeners a fright or anything like that, but I think it's always good to be aware of different areas that we can improve and be more in control of how our body moves and make ourselves more robust longer term to the performance demands that we've got. Because we're talking from addressing strength imbalances from an athletic perspective here rather than just how you look. But we all know that how you look is fueled by the fact that you need to be able to train hard for long periods of the year without taking injury breaks.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, like generally muscles that are the same size are going to be pretty much the same strength, give or take a little bit. So if you have a really, really big imbalance, it probably does show in your physique a little bit as well. So if you are really serious about that, then having that balance is going to be probably quite important to you as well.
We spoke about where do you think it shows in my physique, and I thought it was interesting that we thought maybe it would be kind of the upper back rhomboid muscles, the kind of inner upper back muscles of the upper back, which are probably the most important to holding an upright posture, which I think I'm good at doing. However, versus maybe my lats or my triceps or my rear delts or whatever, which are well known as kind of strengths in my physique when it comes to taking photos on Instagram and whatnot. There's probably the fact that I can't upright row as much with a dumbbell from a high pull probably does show aesthetically in my very upper mid back, and
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, definitely.
and I think that's an interesting one where we're critiquing certain areas. Being aware of that actually shows in performance, and it's one of the big kind of fitness menopause learnings that I've had over the last 6 to 9 months, around knowing that there are areas of performance that you can improve that do end up being reflected in your physique. So we've done those for the upper body, Chris. Let's talk a little bit about lower body. I know we spoke about the step up test, which is a big benefit for us, but how do we work our numbers to understand where our strength should lie across these different movements?
So the three movements we're going to look at for the lower body are a deadlift, a back squat, and then the front rack step up we mentioned earlier. So we're going to take the deadlift as 100%, like we did for the pull up. And let's just say, for argument's sake, it's 150 kilos.
Yep.
This is going to correlate across any rep scheme. So let's just do a 1 rep max just for argument's sake. And then the next one down, the back squat, is going to be 80% of that. So here that would be 120 kilos, again, for the same rep scheme, the 1 rep max. And then the front rack step up is a third of the deadlift, meaning 50 kilos here.
Yeah, so that's us working through those percentages for 1 rep for each of those movements. Now, I know a lot of people are probably thinking, yeah, my back squat can probably be about 20% less than my deadlift. That makes a bit of sense. I think where they're going to get the fright, likewise with the high pull when the upper body, is the fact that their step up needs to be of such a level of weight with a front rack position with a dumbbell. They've got to maintain their core stability and then drive up for what is a fairly dynamic movement with a stationary start point, which I think is hard to deal with.
I think like the biggest thing you're going to find here is people who maybe shy away from getting into a deep squat get really shown here that their problem is quite big, because where you're starting in a step up, you are in a deep squat already if you're using the correct box height. So there's no getting out of it. There's no just kissing parallel and hoping that people didn't see it. You're right down there. So if you're not strong there, you're not getting up onto the box, and it's going to be pretty obvious.
Yeah.
So yeah, a third of the deadlift is the step up, and what we're looking for there is, can you hinge equally as well as the squat? Are you equally as strong at the bottom of the squat as you are just above that? And again, are you equal left to right in the squat as well?
Yeah, because the third movement there, the step up, is single leg and unilateral, we are really rinsing, repeating, and kind of nudging away at that imbalance between the two sides and really identifying, am I getting another 2 reps with my left side, or is it bigger than that? And how do I address that over the longer term? So
the great thing about this is it's so simple. You just need to do it. So for the step up, for the press, for the high pull, the more you do them, the better you get. The unconventional suggestion I give to people that have a really big imbalance is, whichever your weaker side is, do an extra set on that side every week. So if you normally do 3 sets of 8, do 4 sets of 8 on your left leg if it's the weaker side. Some people might look at that and think that's a bit strange, but it's just going to speed up that process of catching them up. You're probably still doing bilateral movements. You're probably still barbell squatting. You're probably still deadlifting. You're probably still overhead pressing. So that imbalance might not even change if all you're doing is just a couple sets of single arm stuff where it's equally weighted. So you need to try and nudge it in the direction you want. And sometimes that does take an extra set.
Yeah, being willing to do the stuff that we're bad at was actually a theme in the episode that we had with Sarah as well, where she was embracing some of her weaknesses with gymnastics and running. And I think when it comes to the imbalances that we've got, making sure that we embrace the fact that, listen, if we are genuinely serious about not having a lopsided OHP or a lopsided barbell back squat, then we probably have to step away and do those humbling single arm unilateral movements or single leg, that aren't particularly rewarding, because some of the sessions you do with them are going to be quite hard. Like, you're going to feel really fatigued if you get 10 reps on your right side, but then you have to battle to work your way up to a position where 10 reps is possible with your left side. It's going to feel quite unpleasant, and you're going to have to put yourself in a place where you're like, oh God, I really kind of dreading that part of my program. But if your program was all just, oh, that felt amazing, that feels amazing, that feels amazing, as soon as you do something slightly different, you're going to get exposed. So I think even from my perspective, somebody who's extremely routined and habituated, knowing that there's parts of my program that kind of put me in a little bit of a difficult position, but there's a long-term aim to why I'm doing them, is a lot easier to get my head around.
Yeah, definitely. I know this from first-hand experience. So this time last year, I had really bad knee pain. It ended up being a tendon issue, but it all stemmed from this left-right imbalance in a step-up.
Yeah.
Luckily, I was able to find out for myself. So I took about 4 or 5 months where I didn't do any barbell squatting outside of some tendon rehab I was doing. Step-ups every week. Came to the end of this 4 or 5 months. Hadn't touched a barbell back squat. Reintroduced myself. Within a few weeks, I actually hit a PB back squat, like lifetime PB, and all I had done was step ups. So, like at the time, like doing some weeks 3 sets of 15 step ups with an extra set on my weak side was pretty awful. I probably didn't really want to go to the gym that day, but knowing what could possibly happen for it, it's definitely worth it in the long run.
Yeah, the step up's a movement as well that's like it's not fashionable at all in bodybuilding circles, like at all. But I think that's because it is so mobility heavy. It's not like an entry level movement. Whereas, and to be fair, this is probably not true, but most people should be able to sit in a leg extension and bang out some decent reps. I mean, people still can't, but could you get somebody to put a dumbbell in a front rack position or a barbell in a front rack position and knock out some step ups? They probably wouldn't do it because it's the awkwardness of setting it up in the gym. But if you commit to doing it, it's the same as a lot of things in life, and a lot of things that I actually quite enjoy myself are doing some things that other people don't really necessarily like to do, because quite often that's where the improvement lies, which can be almost a faster improvement, like you had with your barbell back squat, because you did some pretty unglamorous stuff that a lot of people be like, but you know what, I'm not going to do that rehab, I'm not going to do that work, whereas you did and it paid off.
Yeah, I mean, it had been like years since I'd hit a PB in my back squat, and then all it took was 4 or 6 months, whatever it was, of not doing it and doing the step ups and fixing my imbalance that I'm sure I probably had for a really long time. And it only just stemmed as pain kind of right at the end there. But yeah, it was doing that stuff that I didn't really want to do, but I knew was good for me, so I kind of forced myself to do it.
Now, there's a really mixed audience that listen to this. I think there are a lot of people that do group fitness, and you're probably speaking to your audience when you say this, Chris, but what about those that do group programming? What will they need to do to be a bit stricter in terms of addressing their imbalances? Because obviously the programs that they turn up and do are for the vast majority of people there to meet most of their needs, not absolutely all of them. What would they maybe look at doing to strip that out? I know you've mentioned doing an extra set, but what other stuff might they look at?
So generally, a group program is going to be built for the average person. But the problem is most people aren't the average person. Like when you bring everyone together, it becomes this average, but everyone has these little things that they need to be working on. So let's say it's, for example, your squat is way stronger than your deadlift in terms of those percentages, and you really need to work on that. So your average program might have you squatting once a week and deadlifting once a week. But you're already great at the squat. You don't need to be doing it just as much as you're deadlifting. So maybe if you're saying one squat 1 week and deadlift in that week as well, maybe the next week all you do is deadlift, just so you can try and bring that up. So for some people, this might just be choosing which days you're going to the gym and doing the program, if you know what it is ahead of time. For others, it might need to be a conversation with your coach to explain what's going on and say why you need to do it. Most people generally most people who are in fitness are there to help. So if they see this as for your benefit, I'd be quite surprised if somebody turned you down when you're like, well, my back really hurts and I really need to fix this movement. You'd be surprised how much they really want to help and go out of their way to do that as well.
Yeah, I think there's 2 core principles that we've addressed there when it comes to programming for these imbalances, and that's the first of those is frequency that you've mentioned there. When it comes to, if you know that, like you said, the squat's a massive strength but the deadlift's not, then deadlift frequency needs to go up within your week of training or your month of training or your 6 weeks of training, whatever time length of view that you take. Likewise, your volume needs to be changed as well. So you've already said around adding an additional set for the side that is weaker, and that adds up over time. So if, let's say, like you said, the example was 3 sets of 8 becomes 4 sets of 8, you're accumulating an extra 8 reps every single time that you do that each week, and that will add up over time and should lead to hopefully an evening out of that. I certainly like the priority principle as well, so making sure that you maybe start with your weaker side, because how many times, and I gave the example of the single arm row when I train with somebody, they're like, oh, I'm going to do my right side first because that's my good arm, and then they get more reps, and then inevitably their left side then lags further behind because you're kind of less able to do so.
Yeah, you're making it worse every time you do that. And I have heard the argument that you should start with the strong side to give the weak side something to aim for. And like that probably works for people who are maybe a little bit weak-minded and just like, oh, just give up. Like, that's good enough. But for someone who's reasonably well-trained, like you probably push past that point, and all you're going to be doing is, like you just said, making that worse, where you're getting 15 reps on your strong side and 10 on the right. And over 3 sets, that's an extra 15 reps you've just done. So next time it's probably going to be an extra 18 reps, extra 20 reps, and it builds from there and just gets worse and worse.
Yeah, the whole frequency, volume, and then priority principle is kind of 3 helpful ways to start to build these maybe less favorable movements into the program. Equally, I think when we're looking at the movements we're talking about, particularly the single leg step up, the single arm overhead press, and the high pull, they're relatively risk-free movements for going towards failure. They're not necessarily that heavily loaded. And I know we've talked about there's so many things within our hierarchy of needs that lead to maybe a lower back flare up in a deadlift because maybe our recovery is terrible, our mobility is poor, our technique isn't the be all and end all. But it's quite funny that with these movements that we're asking you to look at incorporating into the program to work on your overall strength balance, they're actually ones that you can push quite far and overload over time quite quickly.
Yeah, and I think the good thing, if you take the step up specifically, the bar's on the front, so if you don't make it, all that happens is you go back down to the floor and you can put the bar off your shoulders. If that bar was on your back and you start tipping forwards, bad things could potentially happen, so having it on the front's a lot safer, and it being a step up rather than a squat where you start down and go up, failure is just landing back on the floor again. It's probably scary the first time you do it. You're like, oh no, and then you're just like, oh okay, I'm on the floor, it's fine.
Yeah, there's like easy bailouts for these movements that don't mean that you're gonna like go to Snap City. Whereas if we were saying to you, yeah, you really need to be working on your deadlift and overloading that a lot harder, it's a lot. There's a lot more risk within that decision to smash up your numbers in your deadlift versus this. So I think overall that's a lot of the general guidelines that we would hope to see in terms of the different percentages involved for each of these movements, some of the different common imbalances, and some of the different areas of pain. I think one area that maybe we want to underline when it comes to the pain element, Chris, before we sign off, is with regards to some of the kind of common key complaints around pain that actually are wrongly identified as something else, but they are identified as imbalances. So do you want to just underline again some of the challenges that people might see with their knee or their lower back because of maybe left to right imbalances?
Yeah, so let's just say your right leg is stronger than your left. Every squat that you do, 2 things can happen. Either your right leg can try really, really, really hard to make up for the left, and because of that, it gets sore. Or your left is trying to keep up with the right as hard as it can, can't handle it, gets sore. Same thing could apply to the low back. One side of your body's working really, really hard, it just tires out, or the weak side can't quite keep up, tires out, is then sore. We have a capacity, and I know we touched on this in the workshop we did. Every day, everything adds up onto that capacity. Your stress from work, how well you slept, what you've been eating, everything that's going on in the world around you, your deadlift form, how strong your right leg is. And if you exceed that capacity, something's going to happen. You might just not be able to do the next rep. Your back might blow out. You don't actually really know until it happens. But by just correcting these issues, you have a higher ceiling, basically. You can do a lot more with a lot less risk, with a lot less effort, and without the worry of going into the gym and not being able to tie your shoes at the end of it because your back hurts so much.
Yeah, I think that's really, really helpful, because so many times people almost misidentify where some pain is coming from. Like you say, they maybe point to their form with it for a deadlift, or they point to well, sometimes actually I'm quite pleased when they point to, oh, I slept poorly the night before or something like that. That actually,
that's a good one. Yeah.
that's almost correct. But more often, not like you say, it's quite often because of the imbalances. And throughout this episode, I like to think that we've addressed some of those and given people a way forward for that. Other things within the hierarchy of needs that I think people might be interested in chatting about on future episodes are things like flexibility, mobility, rest and recovery, and then skill. So at this point, guys, if you're listening and you're very keen to see some of these, then you need to get on to Chris and I. If you create enough hype and you bother us enough, we will absolutely look at another episode. The last thing really to ask you, Chris, is where's the best place for people to reach out to you? They might want to do the workshop that I've done with you, which again is all COVID friendly, isn't it, in terms of over Zoom?
Yeah. So that's all over Zoom. I'm sure we'll end up running another one of those probably in the new year. But the best place to get me is Coach Chris Mota on Instagram, or my business page is Pain Free Performance Co. And yeah, I'm active on there a lot. I run Pain Free Performance with one of my friends, Kyle. We've worked together for quite a while, and between us, it's a pretty well-oiled machine. So yeah, either of those places are the best ones to get me at.
Fantastic. That'll be in the show notes below. Hopefully everyone's enjoyed this. Please take a screenshot, pop it in your Instagram story, tag Chris. His handle will be in the show notes. Tag myself. I cannot wait for your feedback, and I'm sure that there will be some sort of strength and balance that you can address and improve on off the back of this episode. I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.